Hi everyone, and welcome to a video going over how I teach violin and viola hold. It's the same for both instruments. In the first lesson we will have already gone over the basic violin and viola hold, which will then sort of maintain their progress for probably the first term, maybe slightly sooner depending on how quickly they get on to using fingers. But I thought it'd be helpful to go through how I teach it and why I teach it in that particular way, and why I think it's important for us all to try and use that same approach. So the first thing to say is that violin and viola hold is something that is very, very easy for students to get wrong, because the way they might be doing it might feel a little bit easier to them at the moment in the short term. However, if that is not corrected, or if it is not set up properly in the first place, it's very easy for bad habits to form, which can then lead to some pain and some tension. And it can make it much more difficult to tackle harder music because the technique isn't there in the first place to be able to establish it. So I mentioned in my video on how I would teach a typical first violin and viola lesson, the sort of beginner approach to holding the instrument. And I would say that I still go through this with my Year 9 students. I still think it's important to refresh their memory and insist upon these sort of basic steps. So the first thing they learn is how to hold it in rest position, position 1, which is holding it in their left hand, with their left hand on the left shoulder of the instrument on their left knee, with the strings facing out. From there, to go into position 2, I get them to go through a few steps that may seem a bit silly, but that are very important for establishing a good posture. So the first step is to hold the instrument out in front of them as though they're stopping traffic. Then I get them to wear it as a silly hat. Then I get them to slide it down the left-hand side of their face until it reaches their shoulder. All of this part is to make sure that there is a gap here. If they just go straight from position 1 to position 2, often they're just holding it in front of them on their collarbone, not the shoulder. They then have to put their head down, and their left hand is often against their torso. None of those things are helpful for them. So, position 1, then to go into position 2, stop traffic, wear it as a silly hat, slide it down the side of their head until it reaches the shoulder, and from there they can then turn their chin to rest on the chin rest. And all of this needs to be while there's a big gap here. From there, that is the main hold, because when they're playing, whether it's pizzicato or with a bow, that can stay like that. It needs changing when they're ready to incorporate their left-hand fingers, when they're ready to start playing notes other than the open strings. And this is where it has a potential to get quite tricky, because they will try and do several things. They will try and grip very, very tightly, because the idea of having to hold on to something takes over, that kind of instinct takes over. They will try and put their wrist up like this. I've never really understood why, because that seems to me a bit counterintuitive, but they do. And they will try and have their thumb up very, very, very high like that. Those are the things that seem to be very, very common. Okay, so there are different stages that we've developed to make sure that we can try and avoid that wherever possible. So the first thing is, once they're in position 2, I get them to basically make a V with their thumb and their first finger, and from there I get them to whoosh their left hand back, and I say until it hits the bottom of the instrument, the scroll here. What should ideally happen is essentially it's kind of the knuckle here that hits the scroll, and that helps to space it out. So we do that together. I'm very conscious that I'm trying not to hit my wall with my violin. So we do that together. I say, right, make a V, and then after 3 we're going to whoosh our hand back. 1, 2, 3, whoosh. And it's really important at this stage to make sure that there's a straight line going all the way down from their palm to the elbow. That is a straight line. None of this, none of that. And the way that I have found it most helpful to sort of reiterate that is I ask them to imagine that they have an imaginary friend living on their wrist. And I can't remember how or why or when it became a sloth, but it did. I have a feeling there are some students responsible for that one, but it worked, and so it's stuck. So I get them to imagine they've got a pet sloth that lives on their wrist here. And it lives there by clinging onto the wrist and just living here, just lying here, as though this is a trunk of a tree, and they're gripping on here. And once they can imagine that sloth here, and I've had students do all sorts of creative things. I've had students draw a very intricate sloth on the palm of their hand. I've had students bring in little tiny toys that they can use a hairband to secure there. But of course, the power of imagination is all that's needed here. Once they can imagine that, every time they do that, it is weirdly fun to be able to say, your sloth's dead, you killed it, got to call the RSPCA. Or if they do that, your sloth's fallen off. The sloth's lazy, it's not going to move, so it's fallen off. And I found that literally after the first lesson of doing this, students were checking each other, and we'd get to the end of a performance and we'd do feedback, and one of them would say, well, you know, such and such a person, they wouldn't get a very high score because their sloth was dead, it was squished, it couldn't breathe. And they just get to the stage where they check each other, and that's ideal because it means that you can focus on other things, and you know that they understand what they should be doing, even if they're not quite ready to do it themselves yet. So they make a V. After 3, we whoosh our hand back. 1, 2, 3, whoosh. Check that there's a straight line here, and check that your sloth is alive. That's all I say. Check your sloth's alive, or check your sloth can breathe. From there, I then say, can you try and make sure that if we've got our imaginary sloth here, sloths are very lazy. They are not going to move if they don't have to. But we want to imagine you've got a nice big fat juicy leaf on the back of your hand, and again I've had students draw leaves on the back of their hands. Obviously I'm not suggesting that they should do that. If there's a nice big leaf there that they need to get to be able to eat, can we please make sure, I'll try and demonstrate this, that there is a gap here so that the sloth can reach through to get to that leaf. Because what we don't want is we don't want students to collapse the violin into the valley, I suppose, there. It needs to be, there needs to be a gap there so that the sloth can reach the leaf. Some of them get a bit confused at this point because they can't quite, they feel like they're going to drop their instrument, they can't quite figure out how and where they grip it. And it should just very simply sit, I'll show you higher up so you can see it, between the sort of tip of the thumb and just below that middle knuckle on our forefinger. That's where it should be. And at this point we've asked them to do so many things and manipulate their hands in so many ways that they weren't expecting to have to do, that it's a good idea to suggest if they want to just hold on to their instrument there while we practice it, they can. And that's also quite good because it gets them used to holding the violin or viola without gripping it in the left hand. And from there, once I've said, right, make sure there's a gap there, I just say, right, can you make sure that your thumb is always going to be opposite your first finger? Because often what will happen is, to try and counteract this sort of sense of lack of balance that they've got, they'll stick their thumb back like this, and that then causes tension where we don't want it. What happens there is as soon as you do that, your wrist goes higher. Okay, so thumb opposite our first finger. And then a really good exercise that again I still get them to do all the time, all the way through to the year 9, is I just say, right, now we're just going to tap all 4 fingers up and down on the E string, then over onto the A string, making sure they bring the elbow around each time we go down a string, then onto the D string, and then all the way onto the G string. You can see my elbows swinging around here, then back, then to the A string, then to the E string. And it's important to break this up with giving them lots of opportunities to sit in rest position, because it is tiring. So it is going to be hard work. All of those different things are how I would start any lesson once they get to the stage where they're introducing left-hand fingers. There's no point introducing the fingers until they're really comfortable with that violin hold. I would start introducing it a couple of lessons before I plan on introducing the fingers, just so we can get used to that. They get very excited because then they start to recognise violinists they might see on TV or on YouTube, because they know that they're holding it in the same way. So we make a big deal about, oh, now you've graduated onto the grown-up violin and viola hold. It's very exciting. So those are the things that I would use, the exercises I would use, and I would use them pretty much at the start of every lesson. It doesn't have to take as long as it has done now. It can be very, very quick as a warm-up, and to just make sure that we're constantly checking, most importantly, that there's a straight line here, that the wrist is in line with the arm, that there's a gap underneath the neck of the violin for the sloth to reach through, and that they can tap all 4 fingers with their thumb staying opposite the first finger. Okay, so I hope that was helpful, and I'll do a separate video on how I would then go from that to actually introducing the left-hand fingers. Thanks, goodbye.